Hi, scholars. This video shows you how to code, and specifically how to code for rhetorical features. You'll use coding to count features within your sampled primary texts. In primary research, coding refers to the process of identifying and labeling specific units or categories of data in order to analyze and interpret it. In qualitative research, coding is often used to identify patterns, themes, and relationships in the data. It's an important step in the data analysis process because it allows researchers to organize and classify the data in a way that makes it easier to understand and interpret. By using codes, researchers can identify and analyze specific units or categories of data and draw conclusions about the overall patterns or trends in the data. If you haven't already, watch these two videos that will describe coding in general before we talk about how it'll be done in our class specifically. You're going to combine framework and grounded theory in your final project. Framework analysis starts with the framework and develops codes before you start the process of analysis in order to answer specific questions about the text. Grounded theory begins by analyzing the texts and generates codes based on what you see within the texts. So you should use a combination of these for your primary research, but for the research proposal, you'll focus on developing codes using frameworks. You'll then add more codes based on grounded theory during the actual process of coding. Use sources from your literature review to develop codes specific to your topic. Develop a list of possible codes based on codes used in previous studies, codes suggested by theoretical frameworks, codes suggested by unanswered questions in the literature review, and codes based on a preview of the population. That's kind of like using grounded theory. Try to think about both broad categories and some specific codes within those categories you expect to see. For example, you might have a category called insults, which you then break down into specific types of insults. Insults based on intelligence, on physical appearance, skill, identity. You might even break down those categories into smaller subcategories. For example, you might break down insults based on identity to insults based on gender or insults based on race, and then break each of those down to see which genders or races are the basis for the most insults. Now let's talk about coding specifically for rhetorical strategies and the rhetorical situation. So the most useful code you'll have is probably exigence. This is what the text is about. It can be broken into 3 levels. Subject, just what the text is about. Need, what problem or situation is the text responding to, and purpose. What is the text attempting to accomplish? So you can just do one of those, or you can explore all 3, or just a couple as relevant for your project. Sometimes we can code for audience. So who was the text intended for? You can figure this out based on textual clues or on the publication venue or location. Probably you'll have all of the audience be the same, so it might not be worth coding for, but you never know. Author, who wrote the text and what do you know about them? This can be really useful for some social media posts, but we have to be careful about some of the assumptions that we might make about those authors. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so that's coding for rhetorical situation. Of the rhetorical situation, the exigence, again, is probably the most useful to most students. Why don't you take a moment right now and see if you can come up with some possible exigencies, so subjects, that you might expect to see in the population of text you're analyzing. Coding for rhetorical appeals. So the next slides break down the appeals into logos, ethos, and pathos, but you don't necessarily need to use that classification system. Instead, you can just count each time the text uses a basic rhetorical strategies, for example, giving examples, using repetition, metaphor or simile. There's a list linked on the slideshow, and you can find several of these lists anywhere on the internet. Okay, let's talk about coding logos, where we look at claims, reasons, evidence, and fallacies. So types of claims, types of reasons, types of evidence, and possibly fallacies if they're common in your chosen forum. Coding for main claims and exigence. If the text you're coding makes some common arguments, you can code for common claims or types of claims. If you do this in broad categories, it can be combined with codes for exigence, the issue or the problem. That is, what is the claim about? For example, any claim about gun control could be labeled gun control, GC. If there's less variety among the claims, you can count each individual claim. For example, we need more gun control could be coded as GC plus, and we need less gun control could be coded as GC minus. Sometimes students benefit from coding the claims by their stasis or what type of claim. So what kinds of arguments are common in the community that you're studying? Are they making arguments of existence or fact? So what is the nature of reality, of definition or language, which is how should words or events be defined or interpreted? Cause and effect, what are the causes or effects of an event or phenomena? Values or quality, what are the values of an object? Is it good or bad? An action, what should we do? What actions or policies will solve a particular problem? So you might code and say that 30% of the claims are action claims, or 80% are causality. Maybe, for example, there's a lot of people making claims about who's to blame for the topic. That would be a causal problem, instead of what we should do to solve the problem, which would be action. After analyzing claims, you might want to analyze reasons. This can be really valuable when combined with values, which also overlaps with ethos later on. So you might group reasons according to broad values. For example, economics. X action is good because it will reduce the federal deficit. Or we should do X because it will slow climate change would be coded under environmentalism. Coding for types of evidence, so what's commonly used in this community to support their claims and reasons. So do they use examples or use anecdotes? Do they cite authorities, give firsthand experience? Do they cite polls, studies, statistics? Sometimes you can even trace the reaction to different types of evidence to figure out which types of evidence are most accepted or rejected. You might code for types of logical fallacies. Political arguments, for example, might have a lot of logical fallacies in them. So I have a list of logical fallacies linked online, and you can find others with the web search. So Logos is coding again for claims, reasons, evidence, and fallacies. Next, let's talk about ethos. Ethos is about identity, values, and credibility of the author. So why do we trust or believe or listen to that particular person? It's particularly valuable for connecting textual practices to social roles, identities, and even values and beliefs. When analyzing ethos, create specific categories or different strategies authors use to attempt to create a sense of identity and credibility for themselves. While you might draw these strategies from the following page as your starting point, adjust them and break them down further for your own community needs. So some ethos strategies include sharing personal information. You could have a broad category, sharing personal information, and then break that down to the specific types of information that your community might share. For example, do they share their education? Do they tell personal stories? Are those personal stories about their family or about their work? How does the writer try to identify with the reader? So where do they share values with the reader? Again, this can overlap with your logos analysis when you analyze reasons. So are they using reasons based on community values? Does the audience care about the values being supported there? Are the reasons recognizable for the intended audience? Do they use some kind of shared language that the audience would recognize? Adopting authoritative voice, do they use the appropriate jargon for the community? Do they recognize counter arguments? Do they cite sources? They might voice merge. This means borrowing authority from a source. So voice merging could be a code. Sometimes we can analyze for a point of view, for example, how often they use first person or second person. Coding for values can be really useful for making claims in your discussion section. So what values are being expressed, reflected, or promoted within the text, either explicitly or implicitly. So values like accountability or generosity, patriotism or nature. I've linked a list of values you could look at here. Again, something that you could Google to find your own lists. The ethos strategies really are community specific. So for example, if you're in a parenting support group, a kind of personal information that you might share is how many children that you've raised. So you could code kids and number. For example, if they have 5 children, kids 5. If it's a fandom, maybe they build credibility by referencing obscure characters or lore. Code could be obscure. And coding for pathos. So this is emotions, descriptions, and word choice. You gather 2 types of information when analyzing for pathos. Which emotion is the rhetor trying to produce in the audience, and what strategy the rhetor is using to create that emotion. The goal in analyzing both the emotion and the strategy is to see if there are any interesting patterns. For example, maybe rhetors use stories about personal experience mostly to evoke sympathy, and stories about history to evoke outrage. This would give you a great data set to write a paragraph later about in your research article. Code for the emotions the rhetor seems to be trying to evoke or produce in the audience, not necessarily the emotions the rhetor is feeling themselves. Code for commonly evoked emotions, for example, sympathy, gratitude, patriotism, and note that might overlap with values sometimes. I have a list of emotions linked that you could look at. Coding for pathos strategies. So count how often the author uses descriptive language to recreate an experience or bring to life a specific image, person, or place in order to evoke a specific emotion that will make the audience more receptive towards their claim. Coding for word choice. So coding frequently used emotional words. So you might have other kinds of word choice, for example, jargon and ethos, but these are emotionally evocative words, words with strong emotional connotations. For example, you can code for what's called devil terms. So God terms are terms that are guaranteed a positive result, emotional reaction in the audience, and devil terms are terms that are guaranteed a negative emotional reaction. Note that these are really community dependent. What's a God term in one community might be a devil term in another community. And you can code for things like figurative language, metaphor, simile, understatement, whatever seems relevant for your particular topic. If the goal of coding is to see how often a topic is mentioned, you may want to combine all synonyms for a word within the same code. However, for pathos analysis, it may be interesting or even important to see which specific word was chosen, since each word may have a different connotation. For example, if gender is an important part of your project, you might want to count which of the following terms get used the most: boy, man, gentleman, male, girl, woman, lady, female. So not just that these things are talked about, but which specific words are being used. The next video, we'll talk about coding for some other kinds of theoretical frameworks and show you the process for what the coding process might look like. Bye.